This video is brought to you by Squarespace, and if you want to save 10%, use the code ADAM, A-D-A-M, and you will save 10%. Hey guys, today we have the Fuji GFX 100. This is a 100 megapixel, I think 102 megapixel medium format mirrorless camera. This is the Mac Daddy of mirrorless medium format. In fact, I don't think there's anything else like it. This is a beautiful magnesium alloy weather sealed body. It is a pro body. So any of you guys that are accustomed to shooting a pro body like a Canon 1DX Mark II, this is going to feel very, very similar and very similarly comfortable in the hand. One of the nicest things about having a pro body is having both the vertical and the horizontal and the vertical grips, because most cameras just have the horizontal grip. Some cameras have the ability to add the vertical grip. This one has the vertical grip built in, which is awesome. And not only does it have the vertical grip built in, but it's got all of the buttons and all the little functionality bits that you would have. So over here you've got the thumb nubbin for horizontal, you've got the thumb nubbin for vertical over here, you've got the little joystick over here for horizontal, you've got the joystick over here for vertical. Okay, so you guys get the idea. You got the same kind of controls. You've got two different shutter buttons. You've got the shutter lock on the vertical grip, which is great because oftentimes if you're shooting and you forget about the lock, it's very easy to hit it or you put it in your bag, and etc., etc. This also has on its sensor, it's got built-in image stabilization, which is amazing because typically with a high megapixel mirrorless camera, without image stabilization, you can get things like ghosting. It's very common on a lot of cameras, and with this camera, because of the built-in image stabilization, that is greatly reduced. I think it's something like 5.5 stops of image stabilization built in. So that means the sensor basically kind of moves to mitigate shake. How cool is that? This camera also has phase detect autofocus, and it's got phase detect autofocus points that go all the way to the edges of the LCD sensor. The autofocus is absolutely awesome. It's dead on, it's tack on, and in addition to having phase detect autofocus, it also has IAF. So it's borrowed the same phase detect autofocus and IAF from the X-T3, which is perfectly fine. It works absolutely great. In fact, I'm so impressed with how efficient it is and how well it works, because coming from the medium format world, focusing is never something that's great. You know, typically with the old school medium format, you got one focus point. Now with the mirrorless medium formats, with the GFX 50S and 50R and the X1D, you've got contrast detect autofocus, which is not terrific. It's slow, it hunts, it doesn't really like backlighting, whatever. Okay, so the focusing system has been completely upgraded and it's absolutely excellent. It really works well. In addition to all of that, Fuji decided, hey, while we're at it, let's give it a really kick-ass processor. I'm going to put the lens on here and I'm going to show you guys. I'm just going to give you a non-scientific idea of how absolutely quick this thing shoots. Okay, so boom. I mean, come on guys, that's insane. It is literally, now look, it's writing, okay? You guys can see that it's writing the files here because these are 210 megabyte, 16-bit uncompressed raw files. Man, there's a lot of jargon going on here. But these are massive files. They are loaded with detail, loaded with information. Another thing that Fuji did is it's a backlit sensor. They did away with the filter, the IR filter. So that means that you have a lot less chance of having any kind of like noise on your images, a lot less moire or no moire for that matter. And I can say that in shooting with the GFX 100, I have not noticed fringing. I've not noticed chromatic aberration. These are very common things that you get, especially when you're shooting wide open on a mirrorless high megapixel camera. I'm not seeing that with this camera. In fact, the results that I get from this camera are pretty freaking stellar. They're amazing. I love the look of the 50 GFX and the 50 GFX-R, the GFX 50R. I think that those images are incredible. I think that they're absolutely full of detail and full of resolution. However, this GFX 100 really takes it to a whole new level. It's a combination of all of the technology, all of the development, everything that they've put into this, and the files look amazing. And it's easy to think that you could be intimidated by a 100 megapixel medium format sensor. I mean, the sensor is like, I think the ratio is like 1.7 times larger than a full frame sensor. So it's almost, okay, I don't even want to start pulling out a bunch of numbers because you guys can look up numbers like that, but I can tell you that it is massive comparatively. So I think that the, again, I'm going to probably mess this up, but I think that the raw file is just under 12,000 pixels across by just under 9,000 pixels high, which is amazingly huge, okay? All, stats aside and file size aside, that's not really the whole thing about this camera. It's not about the size, it's about the resolution. So if you're somebody who's an architectural photographer, if you're a landscape photographer, even if you're a portrait photographer, the level of detail, the level of separation, the level of latitude that you have with these files is so unbelievably incredible that you really have just infinite possibilities when you're shooting with the GFX 100. Just a couple of little quick things to just talk about on the body itself that I really, really like. Like the GFX 50S, it's got the removable viewfinder, okay? So the EVF comes on and off. You can also add the tilt adapter onto here. It's got something like 5.69 million dots, so it is an extremely high resolution EVF. It is bright, it is huge, it looks incredible. It is absolutely amazing, just what you would want to expect from this camera. And when I'm shooting this camera, I have no issue with the nose going on the back because unlike the 50S, that has that little bump out for the LCD screen, the 100 does not have that bump out. And you just heard me, okay, this touchscreen is fantastic. It's really sensitive. In fact, it's such a great touchscreen that I find myself sometimes using the LCD in lieu of the EVF. This is not traditionally how I like to shoot, but because the camera is so big and heavy that oftentimes if I'm trying for a unique angle, like a really low angle or a high angle or something like that, I find that it's easier for me to compose in the LCD and then just touch where I want focus, and it's instantaneous, which I absolutely love. Speaking of the LCD, it's got the same type of articulating screen or dual axis articulating screen that you would have on the 50S. So as you can see, I just pulled it out, so it rotates, about, about 45 down. It rotates all the way 90 up and everything in between. So you've got a lot of latitude in that respect. And then it also has a vertical pop out as well. So that's your other axis. And when you do pull it out for vertical usage, you can also tilt it as well. And one thing that you can do if the EVF is in your way, hang on, is you can obviously move the EVF off, and look at that. You guys have it completely at a 90 and a 90. So I don't know, 180 degrees around over here. A lot of latitude with this LCD. I think the LCD is really absolutely fantastic. I mentioned before, it's a magnesium alloy weather sealed body, so they've used those materials to try to reduce the weight. It still is incredibly heavy, but it is completely weather sealed, which is fantastic. I know I shot this in a little bit of weather, absolutely no issues, completely fine, not anything to even be concerned about. Yes, I definitely don't abuse my gear. I'm not going to go out in a freaking monsoon and take this camera out there, even though I know it probably could handle it. But if it's spitting out or a little bit of weather, I'm not going to be overly concerned. I'm not going to be worried. Yes, I'm going to be careful with it. I'm going to get it back. I'm going to clean it. I'm going to wipe it down, all of that kind of stuff. But because of the weather sealing, I'm confident that water and moisture is not going to get in here and compromise the electronics and the sensor. Okay, moving on to the body. On the top here, we've got this handy dandy little screen, and like the 50S, it's also got the backlit, the different backlit options. But unlike the 50S, this actually gives you the option to get into this retro dial mode, okay? I'm pretty sure you guys can see that. So you go for the info display and the retro dial mode, which is kind of cool, so that if you're adjusting, the shutter speed or the ISO, you can see that it moves. And you can also have your histogram up here if you're somebody who likes to be able to view your histogram. Speaking of displays, we've also got this new handy dandy little info display right here on the back of the camera. Okay, how cool is that? This is a little info display. It just shows you all the different camera settings. It's always on when the camera's on. It's nice, it's backlit so that if you're in a dark situation, you're always going to see it. It's absolutely fantastic. Being a 100 megapixel CMOS sensor, this camera has infinite ISO possibilities. In fact, speaking of ISO, due to the way that they've developed the sensor, the backlit sensor, and the proximity of the sensor to the lens on the mount, they were able to keep the ISO native at 100, which is fantastic. To have that kind of low native ISO, to be able to shoot super clean images, especially with a sensor of this size, is really, really beneficial and excellent. But you can push the ISO. I know that with this camera, I have pushed the ISO, and I've been incredibly impressed as to how far I can push the ISO with this camera and still have relatively or very clean images. In fact, the ISO on this camera you can push to the extent where you don't really have to worry about it. You can shoot it like a modern mirrorless full frame camera in the same respect, where if I need to go to ISO 800, ISO 1000, I don't sweat it. In fact, I've shot some images at like ISO 3,000 or 4,000 that are still very much usable. And being that they're 100 megapixel files, when you reduce the files to, you know, kind of a small size, or if you're just going to post them for social media, there's absolutely zero issue because there is just so much detail in this camera. You know, like the other Fujis, you know, we've got dual card slots that you can program to do a bunch of different things. You've got your headphone and microphone ports over here. I think this thing does 10-bit 4K video. We've got USB-C. We love USB-C. USB-C is awesome. I've tethered this camera to Capture One via USB-C. Not only does it tether, it charges the battery while you're tethering, which is terrific. It's also got micro HDMI if you need it, and regular charging if that's the way you're going to go. Speaking of Capture One, if you're a Fuji shooter, I don't care what Fuji you're using, an X-T3, an X-T30, an X-Pro 2, X-Pro 3, if you're using an X100F, if you're using any of the GFX bodies, whatever, you really need to try to check out Capture One. Now, I am not sponsored by Capture One. I'm not sponsored by Fuji, but Capture One, I can assure you, once you dip your toe into Capture One with these Fuji files, you are not going to necessarily want to be utilizing Lightroom. Yes, Lightroom has a much easier organizational layout. So if you're doing, you know, a session in Lightroom, it's a lot easier to do the grid thing. It's definitely a lot easier to manage your photos in your library. And in fact, in Lightroom, you can have multiple sessions, or you can do giant catalogs where you just have, you know, by year, by month, by project, whatever. Capture One doesn't necessarily offer you the same level of organization. It's a little bit different. I'm not going to get into the nuances and the differences between the two, but I can say that the raw files in Capture One look absolutely amazing, and the amount of latitude that you have as far as recovering highlights and shadows and just pushing all the different all the different parameters in your photos, I feel is so far greater. Let me just put it to you like this. To me, the files look far more organic in Capture One, and it feels a lot more natural. Okay, so here's a grid of images over the last week or so that I shot with the Fuji X100, Fuji GFX 100. And I'm just going to take you through them. So here's the very first image. Hang on one sec. Here's the very first image that I shot. And this is a shot of my truck. I got the camera. The battery was you know, there wasn't a lot of battery. So I just drove to a place that I really love, and I took this shot. And this is a full-size JPEG that I've already edited. I think the JPEG is like 70 megs, and I'm just going to zoom in here. That's 100%, guys. I mean, the amount of detail. Okay, let's just even go in a little bit tighter. All right, that's 200% there. We'll go to 300%. I mean, you can read, you know, the text that's on the headlight here, HB4. You can read the text that's on the little lens cover over there. You can literally read all of the specs on the tire here, okay, guys? I mean, you can imagine I was pretty far away from this when I shot it, and when you double click and you zoom in on there, you've got just infinite amounts of detail. And you can see I was at ISO 100, I was at 1/80th of a second, which, you know, for a camera this size and a sensor that size, to be shooting at 1/80th of a second and have something tack sharp shot wide open at f2, you know, is incredible. Speaking of which, this 110 f2 lens is literally my favorite lens for the GFX. I think this lens is absolutely incredible. I think the amount of separation that you get with this lens is incredible. It's tack freaking sharp wide open. The bokeh, the boku, whatever that thing is, the bokeh is absolutely gorgeous. The fall off is gorgeous. The color rendering is gorgeous. It focuses really, really freaking fast. It's super freaking heavy, but very nicely balanced on the GFX 100. But that lens to me is butter. That is money. And speaking of lenses, I kind of wish that there were more fast lenses for the GFX series. I've tried the 63 2.8, which is a 50 millimeter equivalent. I don't love that lens. I think the look of it's kind of eh. The 45 2.8, which is a 35 millimeter equivalent, we're talking equivalent on full frame. I do like that lens a lot. I think it's really beautiful. I think that the rendering is terrific. I think that it's quite versatile. I should just mention that the 110 is a 85 millimeter equivalent or so on full frame. I've also been playing with the 32 to 64 f4, which is a 24 to 50 millimeter equivalent, thereabouts, okay, in full frame. That lens is fantastic. It's super sharp. It's really versatile. It's nice to be able to just, you know, crank it down and shoot at 24 millimeters, let's say, to get that wide view, and then be able to close it up and get into a 50. The fact that it's f4 it's continuous f4, it's not variable aperture, but f4, I wanted f2 or f2 I want something when I'm shooting, you know, I want to be wider, I want to be more open, you know, I want like a 1.8 or 1.4 lens, or at least a f2 lens. There's a few other, you know, GFX lenses, and I know that there's more coming into the roadmap, but I would like to be able to see some faster glass for the GFX. I know that you can easily adapt other lenses on this camera. You know, that Voigtlander lenses, you know, a lot of people adapt those, and some Zeiss lenses. The cool thing about adapting a manually focusing lens is you're still getting the IBIS, you're still getting the in-camera image stabilization, even though you're not getting autofocus. So, you know, there's a compromise there. But anyway, as we digress. So this is beautiful. This sky was completely blown out. There was no detail there, there was no color there, and I was able to easily recover it and make it look pretty. Here's a photo of my friend Daniel. We were just walking around, just taking a bunch of shots. I was actually playing with his Fuji X Pro 3, which I'm definitely heavily thinking about getting back into the little X series cameras. Anyway, I took this portrait with the GFX and the 110. This was at 1/400th of a second f2. Let me just show you guys. This was with also using the IAF. Now, if we go in at 100%, okay, you guys can see like every dust particle on the lens of his glasses. In fact, if you really pay attention here, you can see that not only did it grab focus on the eyeball, like really did, because you see the eyelashes are so sharp, but the edge of his glasses are just a little bit softer than this plane right here where the eyeball is. So that just tells me that, man, that the IAF on the GFX 100 is incredible. And you know, even if you just look at the skin and you look at the pores, I mean, I didn't retouch this, okay? I edited it, yes. It's definitely been processed, okay? I did some processing on this for sure. I didn't go in there and do any editing. I didn't do any cloning or healing or nothing. And if you look at how absolutely smooth it renders the skin and the skin tones and the little follicles, it looks incredible. I mean, for a 100 megapixel sensor to be able to render so smooth and so beautifully, and if you look at the out of focus areas, I mean, it's crazy. You know, even the fall off just on his jacket from his collar down to his shoulder looks absolutely incredible. I also did a bunch of photos where I lit them, okay? So my sister, she came over and she's an actor and she's like, I need a gritty photo. I need something, that looks a little, just something a little bit grittier than just, your typical, glamour shot, headshot. She wanted something, that spoke to kind of a different vibe. She wanted like to accentuate the cheekbones and something with more drama. So this was a one light shot where I literally had one light boomed over her head. I was actually shooting in this space which has very low ceiling, so I wasn't able to really position it as high as I want. I even had her sitting in a stool, but man, like look at this one-to-one here. I mean, the way that it renders the skin tones and the actual skin itself, you would think like, oh, it's 100 megapixels, it's going to be so sharp, it's not going to hide anything, it's going to look almost, unrealistic, but that is not the case. I mean, the amount of detail, like let's just go in a little further, maybe we'll go in like 200%. The amount of detail that you see in the eyeballs and the iris, but look at this, look at the skin here. I mean, it's absolutely incredible, Yes, I did a little bit of work to this photo. I didn't have to go crazy with it, and that's what I'm trying to tell you guys, is that the photos, that just the raw stuff that this thing captures look fantastic. Okay, moving on. Here's a shot I did on my buddy Rafe. We shot this in his kitchen. I'm doing this kind of series, whatever. This is part of the series, and we don't need to get into that now. This was shot with the 32 to 64 f4 lens. I was at 1/60th of a second at f4, and I was at 58.6 millimeters. That wasn't really, by choice, whatever. It was on a tripod. I had the cameras in a doorway just outside of the kitchen, and I had one light here through the window, and then I had a reflector over here, which you obviously can't see, it was off camera. But man, look at this, look at the fall off, look at just the detail, the eyeballs. I mean, just incredible. Here's another shot that I did of my bud. We had one light, overhead, and then we had one light off on camera right over here. Two light setup, obviously. GFX was on a tripod. I was at 52.7 millimeters. Again, it was on tripods, and that's just how I framed it. It just really came out really well that way. Just the files are gorgeous. I mean, just the focus is incredible. The amount of detail. These images, they're sharp without being clinical. When you're using Capture One, is that all of the profiles that you're using in the Fuji camera are available, so that even, let's say you shoot in like classic chrome, but you want to change it to like Astria or one of the other profiles, you can just do that after the fact. So you're not like, so even though you might associate that profile with the shoot that you're doing or the shot that you're doing, and that's kind of what you're seeing in your preview, because it will apply that to your preview when you're previewing your image, you can completely change that or even lose it entirely if you want to just a linear and a flat kind of an image in post. So you have tons of latitude, but that's another story when it comes to editing in Capture One. So there you go, guys. I think the Fuji GFX 100 is incredible. I think it's an incredible evolution. I would really like to be able to, I would really like to see Fuji take the phase detect and the IAF and the in-body image stabilization and add that to the 50 megapixel GFX 50R, or maybe some kind of an iteration in between. Maybe there'll be an R camera that is that body style and that shape, that kind of rangefinder-y shape that has the technology from this camera, but maybe it would even have a slightly bigger sensor, because it seems like everybody in the camera world is just going bigger. And just to put a fine point on this, it would be amazing to see Fuji enter the full frame realm and have a couple of different options as well. Maybe have like a pro body version, and then maybe a smaller body that you can add a grip to, whatever. Anyway, let's not digress any further. So there you go, guys. That is my first impressions of the Fuji GFX 100. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below, and we'll see you soon.